In the shadowed halls of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Florence's fate had been decided for centuries, there existed a manuscript that few had seen and fewer still understood. It bore no title on its weathered cover, only the seal of Niccolò Machiavelli pressed into wax that had long since cracked with age. The document, written in his careful hand during his final years in exile, contained observations too dangerous for the prince and too profound for his public correspondence. It was a warning about the things that must remain concealed in the exercise of power, and the terrible consequences when such concealment fails. The manuscript began with a simple premise that would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come: there are truths so essential to governance that their revelation would destroy the very foundations upon which authority rests. The wise prince understands not merely what to do, but what must never be spoken, never be written, and never be acknowledged even in the privacy of his own thoughts. Part 1, The Architecture of Necessary Deception. The first section of Machiavelli's hidden treatise dealt with what he termed the architecture of necessary deception, the systematic concealment of certain realities that, while true, would prove catastrophic if widely understood. He had observed this principle in operation throughout his years as a diplomatic secretary, watching as the most successful rulers mastered not just the art of persuasion, but the more delicate craft of strategic silence. Machiavelli wrote of a conversation he had witnessed between Lorenzo de' Medici and a visiting ambassador from France. The ambassador, flush with wine and diplomatic immunity, had pressed Lorenzo on the true nature of Florentine taxation policies. Lorenzo's response was masterful in its misdirection. He spoke eloquently of the burden of governance, the necessity of revenue, and the sacred duty to protect the citizenry. What he did not say was that the tax system was deliberately designed to extract maximum wealth from the merchant class while appearing to burden the nobility. The ambassador left satisfied with Lorenzo's apparent candor, never realizing that the most important information had been the silence between the words. This incident illuminated what Machiavelli came to understand as the first principle of concealment: the ruler must master the art of speaking truth while concealing truth. The former satisfies the immediate demands of honesty and transparency, while the latter preserves the essential mysteries upon which stable governance depends. Machiavelli identified three categories of truths that must remain concealed. The first were what he called structural truths, the fundamental inequalities and contradictions upon which any functioning state depends. Every society, he observed, requires a certain percentage of its population to accept conditions that, if fully understood, they would find intolerable. The peasant must believe that his poverty stems from divine will or personal failings, not from systematic exploitation. The merchant must believe that his taxes fund essential services, not the luxury of those who rule him. The noble must believe that his privilege stems from inherent superiority, not from arbitrary historical accident. The genius of successful states, Machiavelli noted, lay not in the absence of these contradictions but in their elegant concealment. He had watched republics and principalities rise and fall based on their ability to maintain what he termed productive ignorance among their populations. Those states that allowed structural truths to become visible, whether through incompetent leadership, external pressure, or internal discord, inevitably faced revolution, conquest, or collapse. The second category consisted of operational truths, the actual mechanisms by which power is exercised and maintained. Machiavelli had observed that successful rulers always operated according to principles that directly contradicted their public pronouncements. They spoke of justice while practicing favoritism, preached mercy while exercising ruthless pragmatism, and proclaimed their dedication to the common good while pursuing their personal interests with calculating precision. This contradiction was not, as moralists claimed, evidence of hypocrisy or corruption. Rather, it was an essential feature of effective governance. The public required ideals to maintain their allegiance and sense of meaning. The ruler required flexibility to navigate the complex realities of power. The art lay in maintaining both simultaneously without allowing the contradiction to become visible. Machiavelli recalled a particular incident during his diplomatic mission to France, where he had observed King Louis XII address a gathering of provincial nobles. The king spoke movingly of his love for his subjects and his desire to rule justly and fairly. Later that same evening, in a private council meeting that Machiavelli was permitted to observe, the same king coldly calculated which provinces could be taxed most heavily without provoking rebellion, which noble families needed to be eliminated to consolidate royal power, and how best to manipulate religious sentiment to justify an unpopular war. The remarkable thing, Machiavelli noted, was that both performances were entirely sincere. The king genuinely believed in his own benevolence and justice, even as he pursued policies that served neither. This psychological compartmentalization was not a personal failing but a necessary adaptation to the demands of rule. The prince who cannot separate his public ideals from his private calculations will find himself paralyzed by conscience or destroyed by enemies who suffer from no such limitations. The third category of concealed truths involved what Machiavelli termed temporal realities, the true timeframes within which political action operates. Public discourse, he observed, operated on the scale of immediate concerns and moral absolutes. Citizens expected problems to be solved quickly and permanently, evils to be eliminated rather than managed, and progress to be linear and continuous. The actual business of governance, however, operated on entirely different temporal scales. Real change, Machiavelli had learned, occurred over generations rather than years. The most significant policy decisions produced their full effects only after the ruler who made them was long dead. The most pressing crises of the present were often the inevitable consequences of decisions made decades earlier. The wise prince understood that he was simultaneously dealing with the consequences of his predecessor's choices while making decisions whose full impact would not be felt until long after his own death. This temporal mismatch created an essential tension at the heart of all governance. Citizens demanded immediate action and visible results. Sustainable policy required patience, gradual implementation, and acceptance of short-term costs for long-term benefits. The prince who attempted to align his actual governance with the public's temporal expectations would find himself constantly lurching from crisis to crisis, never able to implement the patient, long-term thinking that effective rule required. Machiavelli illustrated this principle with the example of urban planning in Florence. The city's growing population required significant expansion of infrastructure, new roads, expanded markets, improved fortifications. The work was expensive, disruptive, and would not show its full benefits for a generation. Citizens complained about the noise, the expense, and the inconvenience. They demanded that the work be completed quickly or abandoned entirely. The successful ruler, Machiavelli observed, learned to implement such long-term projects while maintaining the fiction that they were temporary measures addressing immediate needs. Each phase of construction was presented as a response to a current crisis rather than part of a generational plan. Citizens were never asked to sacrifice for abstract future benefits that they might not live to see. Instead, they were told that the current inconvenience would solve today's problems, even though the ruler's actual intention was to prepare for challenges that would not emerge for decades. This principle of concealed temporality extended to every aspect of governance. Military preparations were justified by immediate threats rather than long-term strategic positioning. Economic policies were explained in terms of current needs rather than generational wealth building. Social reforms were presented as responses to present grievances rather than investments in future stability. The architecture of necessary deception, Machiavelli concluded, was not an unfortunate requirement of imperfect governance but, rather, the foundation upon which all stable rule rested. The prince who failed to master these arts of concealment, who insisted on complete honesty about structural realities, operational mechanisms, and temporal frameworks, would find himself presiding over a state that could neither function effectively nor maintain the allegiance of its citizens. Yet Machiavelli was careful to distinguish between necessary concealment and arbitrary deception. The truths that must remain hidden were those whose revelation would destroy the capacity for effective governance while providing no corresponding benefit to the governed. The prince who concealed information merely to avoid accountability or to protect his personal interests was engaging in the corruption of a necessary art. The test, Machiavelli suggested, was simple: does this concealment serve the long-term stability and prosperity of the state, or does it merely serve the short-term convenience of the ruler? The former represented the wise application of political necessity. The latter represented the abuse of power that would ultimately destroy both the ruler and the state. As Machiavelli concluded the first section of his hidden treatise, he offered a warning that would prove prophetic: the prince who masters the architecture of necessary deception will find his state prosperous and his rule secure. But he must never forget that this architecture depends upon the continuing ignorance of his subjects. Should the structural truths, operational realities, and temporal frameworks ever become generally understood, the edifice of governance will collapse with stunning rapidity. The wise prince therefore guards these secrets more carefully than he guards his treasure, for they are more precious than gold and more dangerous than armies. Part 2, The Mechanisms of Strategic Silence. The second section of Machiavelli's manuscript explored what he considered the most sophisticated aspect of statecraft, the active management of information flows to ensure that dangerous truths remained concealed while maintaining the appearance of openness and transparency. This was not mere censorship, which Machiavelli regarded as a crude and ultimately ineffective tool, but rather the subtle art of shaping what questions were asked, what topics were discussed, and what possibilities were considered. Machiavelli had observed this principle in operation during his time as a diplomatic secretary, particularly in his interactions with Cesare Borgia. Borgia, whom Machiavelli both admired and feared, had mastered the art of strategic silence to a degree that few rulers achieved. Borgia never lied directly to his subordinates or allies, yet he consistently ensured that they remained ignorant of information that might compromise his plans. The key to Borgia's success lay not in withholding information but in controlling the context within which information was interpreted. When Borgia's generals received intelligence about enemy movements, they received accurate data but within a framework that emphasized immediate tactical concerns rather than long-term strategic implications. They knew what they needed to know to fulfill their immediate responsibilities, but they lacked the broader understanding that might have revealed Borgia's ultimate intentions. This principle of contextual limitation, Machiavelli realized, was far more powerful than direct deception. A subordinate who discovers he has been lied to will lose trust in his leader and may become actively hostile. A subordinate who simply lacks the broader context to understand his leader's full strategy will continue to serve faithfully while remaining incapable of betrayal or interference. Machiavelli identified 5 primary mechanisms through which strategic silence operated in effective governance. The first was what he termed compartmentalization of knowledge. No single individual, apart from the ruler himself, should possess enough information to understand the full scope of state policy. Ministers should understand their own domains but remain ignorant of how their work fitted into broader patterns. Generals should understand their military objectives but remain ignorant of the diplomatic context that shaped them. Diplomats should understand their negotiating positions but remain ignorant of the military preparations that gave them force. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes beyond simple security. It prevented the development of competing power centers within the government, as no subordinate possessed enough information to formulate independent policy or challenge the ruler's decisions effectively. It also prevented the psychological burden of difficult decisions from being distributed too widely. The general who understood only his military mission could execute it with clear conscience, even if the broader political context revealed moral complexities that might have paralyzed him with doubt. Machiavelli illustrated this principle with his observations of the Venetian Republic, whose commercial empire had been built upon the systematic compartmentalization of information. Venetian merchants operating in distant ports knew their trading objectives but remained ignorant of the diplomatic arrangements that secured their access to markets. Venetian admirals understood their naval missions but remained ignorant of the commercial interests those missions served. Venetian diplomats negotiated treaties without full knowledge of the military capabilities that gave their negotiations credibility. This system allowed Venice to maintain an incredibly complex network of commercial, military, and diplomatic relationships while ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise the entire structure. Even when individual merchants were captured, admirals were defeated, or diplomats were corrupted, the broader system remained secure because no single individual possessed enough information to reveal Venice's full strategic position. The second mechanism was the cultivation of productive distraction. Machiavelli had observed that human attention was inherently limited, and that citizens would inevitably focus their political energy on something. The wise ruler therefore ensured that this focus was directed toward issues that were either insignificant in themselves or that served the ruler's broader purposes. Machiavelli had watched Florence's political class become obsessed with questions of ceremonial precedence, religious observance, and artistic patronage while remaining largely indifferent to the fundamental questions of taxation, military organization, and diplomatic alignment that actually determined the city's fate. This was not an accident but rather the result of careful cultivation by Florence's ruling families, who understood that political energy spent on symbolic issues was energy that could not be directed towards substantive challenges to their power. The cultivation of productive distraction operated on multiple levels. At the most basic level, it involved ensuring that public discourse focused on topics that did not threaten essential state interests. Citizens could debate the relative merits of different military commanders, but they were not encouraged to question whether military adventures served the public good. They could argue about the allocation of resources between different public works projects, but they were not invited to examine whether such projects were necessary at all. More sophisticated was the art of channeling legitimate grievances toward targets that could absorb political energy without threatening the fundamental structure of power. Economic hardship could be blamed on foreign competition, corrupt merchants, or divine displeasure rather than on systemic features of the economic order. Military defeats could be attributed to individual incompetence, inadequate resources, or enemy treachery rather than to flawed strategic assumptions. The third mechanism involved the management of expertise. Machiavelli had observed that specialized knowledge was both essential to effective governance and potentially dangerous to political stability. Citizens generally deferred to expert opinion on technical matters, but experts who understood the full implications of their specialized knowledge might become critics of policies that depended on public ignorance of technical realities. The solution, Machiavelli noted, was to ensure that expertise remained fragmented and that experts remained dependent on state patronage for their livelihood and status. Military engineers should understand fortification but remain ignorant of broader strategic planning. Economic theorists should understand trade and taxation but remain ignorant of military expenditures. Legal scholars should understand jurisprudence but remain ignorant of the political considerations that shape legal policy. This fragmentation of expertise served the additional purpose of preventing the emergence of alternative sources of authority that might challenge the ruler's monopoly on comprehensive understanding. Citizens who deferred to expert opinion could be confident that they were receiving technically accurate information while remaining ignorant of the political context that determined how that expertise was applied. Machiavelli illustrated this principle with his observation of the papal court, where he had served as a diplomatic representative. The Pope was surrounded by experts in theology, canon law, administration, and diplomacy. Each of these experts possessed profound knowledge within their domain, and their advice was generally technically sound. However, none of them possessed the comprehensive understanding that would have allowed them to question the broader political strategies that shaped papal policy. The theological experts could advise on matters of doctrine and religious practice, but they remained ignorant of the military and diplomatic considerations that determined which theological positions the Church would actually adopt. The legal experts could advise on matters of canon law and church administration, but they remained ignorant of the political alliances that determined how that law would be interpreted and applied. The diplomatic experts could advise on negotiations with secular powers, but they remained ignorant of the theological and legal constraints that limited their negotiating flexibility. This system allowed the Pope to benefit from genuine expertise while ensuring that no expert possessed enough comprehensive understanding to challenge papal authority or reveal the full complexity of papal decision-making to the broader Christian community. The fourth mechanism was the cultivation of beneficial confusion. Machiavelli had observed that citizens were often more compliant when they were slightly confused about the exact nature of state policies than when they understood those policies clearly. Complete transparency could lead to resistance from those who disagreed with specific policies. Complete opacity could lead to suspicion and paranoia. The optimal situation was one in which citizens understood enough to feel informed but not enough to mount effective opposition. This beneficial confusion was most easily achieved through the deliberate complexity of governmental procedures and the proliferation of competing sources of partial information. Citizens who wanted to understand state policy would find themselves navigating a maze of overlapping jurisdictions, competing authorities, and contradictory official statements. By the time they had sorted through this complexity, either the policy in question would already be implemented or their political energy would be exhausted by the investigation itself. Machiavelli had observed this principle in operation during his diplomatic missions to France, where the royal bureaucracy had evolved into a system of such complexity that even experienced courtiers struggled to understand the actual mechanisms of decision-making. Citizens who wished to petition the king or influence royal policy found themselves referred from one office to another, each of which possessed partial authority over the matter in question but none of which could provide definitive action. This system served multiple purposes. It prevented hasty or ill-considered policy changes by ensuring that any modification required extensive consultation and coordination. It discouraged frivolous complaints by making the complaint process itself sufficiently burdensome to deter all but the most persistent petitioners. Most importantly, it ensured that by the time citizens understood how to navigate the system effectively, they had already been co-opted into it and had acquired a vested interest in its continued operation. The fifth mechanism involved the strategic revelation of lesser secrets. Machiavelli had discovered that citizens had a natural curiosity about the hidden operations of government, and that this curiosity could be satisfied through the controlled revelation of information that appeared significant but did not actually threaten essential state interests. The wise ruler therefore ensured that occasional scandals, investigations, and exposures satisfied the public appetite for transparency while protecting the most important secrets. These strategic revelations served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the ruler's commitment to honesty and accountability, thereby increasing trust in government pronouncements on other matters. They provided outlets for citizen frustration and reformist energy that might otherwise be directed toward more fundamental challenges to state authority. They allowed the ruler to eliminate political enemies or incompetent subordinates while appearing to respond to public demands rather than personal interests. Most importantly, strategic revelations created the impression that significant secrets, once revealed, consisted of relatively mundane matters of personal corruption or administrative incompetence. Citizens who discovered that their suspicions about government secrecy were confirmed by revelations of petty scandals were less likely to imagine that more profound secrets might remain concealed. Machiavelli illustrated this principle with his observations of the Florentine Republic during periods of political transition. Incoming governments routinely discovered evidence of corruption or incompetence among their predecessors, which they revealed with great fanfare as evidence of their own commitment to good governance. These revelations were typically accurate but carefully selected to avoid any information that might reveal the systemic features of governance that transcended individual administrations. Citizens who learned that the previous government had awarded contracts to favored merchants or appointed relatives to lucrative positions felt that their suspicions about government secrecy had been vindicated. They were less likely to suspect that the incoming government was operating according to the same underlying principles and would inevitably engage in similar practices, albeit with different beneficiaries and more careful concealment. As Machiavelli concluded this section of his manuscript, he emphasized that the mechanisms of strategic silence were not merely tools of deception but rather essential features of any stable political order. The state that attempts to operate with complete transparency will find itself paralyzed by the conflicting demands and impossible expectations of its citizens. The state that operates in complete secrecy will find itself isolated from the information and support it requires for effective governance. The art of statecraft lies in navigating between these extremes, ensuring that citizens possess enough information to fulfill their roles while remaining ignorant of truths that would make such fulfillment impossible. Part 3, The Consequences of Failed Concealment. The final section of Machiavelli's hidden manuscript dealt with what he considered the most dangerous aspect of political leadership, the catastrophic consequences that inevitably followed when the architecture of necessary deception collapsed and the mechanisms of strategic silence failed. Machiavelli had witnessed such collapses during his lifetime, and he had studied the historical record of similar failures throughout ancient and medieval history. The patterns he discovered were remarkably consistent and deeply sobering. The collapse of concealment, Machiavelli observed, never occurred suddenly or without warning. Rather, it followed a predictable sequence that wise rulers could recognize and potentially interrupt, though few possessed the courage or insight to take the necessary action. The process began with what he termed the erosion of contextual authority, the gradual loss of the state's ability to control how information was interpreted and understood. Machiavelli had observed this erosion most clearly during the final years of the Florentine Republic, when external pressures and internal divisions had weakened the ruling class's ability to maintain their traditional monopoly on political interpretation. Citizens who had previously accepted official explanations for policy decisions began to seek alternative sources of understanding. Merchants who had accepted taxation as necessary began to calculate its true burden and compare it to the actual benefits they received. Soldiers who had accepted military service as honorable duty began to question whether their sacrifices served any purpose beyond their commander's ambitions. This erosion of contextual authority created what Machiavelli called interpretive space, areas of political life where official narratives no longer commanded automatic acceptance and where alternative explanations could gain credibility. Once such spaces emerged, they tended to expand rapidly as citizens discovered that questioning official interpretations in one area made it easier to question them in others. The expansion of interpretive space led inevitably to the second stage of concealment collapse, the revelation of structural contradictions. Citizens who had previously accepted the logical inconsistencies inherent in all political systems as unfortunate but inevitable began to recognize them as evidence of systematic deception. The gap between public ideals and actual practice, which had previously been invisible or explicable, became glaring and offensive. Machiavelli illustrated this process with his analysis of the collapse of the Roman Republic, which he had studied extensively through the works of Livy and Tacitus. The Roman system had depended upon the concealment of the fundamental contradiction between republican ideals of citizen equality and the practical reality of aristocratic dominance. For centuries, this contradiction had been managed through the complex constitutional arrangements that gave plebeians formal political rights while ensuring that actual power remained concentrated among patrician families. The system worked as long as most citizens accepted the official interpretation that constitutional complexity reflected the wisdom of ancestral arrangements rather than the calculated self-interest of the ruling class. However, once citizens began to understand the true function of constitutional mechanisms, the entire edifice of republican legitimacy became untenable. Citizens who had previously taken pride in Roman constitutional sophistication began to see it as evidence of aristocratic manipulation. The revelation of one structural contradiction inevitably led to the questioning of others. Citizens who understood that constitutional arrangements served aristocratic interests began to question whether military campaigns served the common good or merely provided opportunities for aristocratic enrichment. Citizens who understood that legal procedures protected aristocratic privilege began to question whether economic policies served public welfare or merely consolidated aristocratic wealth. This cascading process of revelation led to the third stage, the collapse of operational effectiveness. Once citizens understood the true nature of the system they were being asked to support, their compliance could no longer be taken for granted. Soldiers who understood that their campaigns served private interests rather than public good became reluctant to serve. Taxpayers who understood that their contributions funded aristocratic luxury rather than public welfare became resistant to collection. Administrators who understood that their procedures served political manipulation rather than justice became unreliable in their implementation. The collapse of operational effectiveness created a vicious cycle that Machiavelli had observed in multiple historical contexts. Reduced compliance forced rulers to rely increasingly on coercion rather than consent. Increased coercion provided additional evidence of the system's oppressive nature, further reducing voluntary compliance. The state found itself trapped in an escalating cycle of violence and resistance that typically ended either in successful revolution or in the establishment of a more openly tyrannical regime. Machiavelli had witnessed this cycle during the final convulsions of the Italian city-state system, when external pressures from France and Spain had forced local rulers to abandon their traditional reliance on citizen militia and consensual taxation in favor of foreign mercenaries and extractive policies. Citizens who had previously supported their city-states as expressions of communal identity began to see them as obstacles to prosperity and security. The more coercive these states became in response to reduced support, the more they confirmed citizen suspicions about their true nature. The fourth stage involved the emergence of alternative authorities. Once the traditional structure of concealment collapsed, citizens did not simply remain in a state of confused independence. Rather, they transferred their allegiance to new sources of authority that promised to provide the clarity and security that the traditional system could no longer deliver. These alternative authorities took various forms depending on the specific circumstances of collapse. Sometimes they were religious movements that promised spiritual salvation from political corruption. Sometimes they were popular leaders who promised to restore traditional virtues that had been corrupted by established elites. Sometimes they were foreign powers that promised liberation from domestic oppression. The common feature of these alternative authorities was their promise to eliminate the gap between public ideals and actual practice that had become visible during the collapse of concealment. Religious movements promised to create communities where spiritual principles would actually govern daily life. Popular leaders promised to establish governments that would actually serve the common good rather than private interests. Foreign liberators promised to establish systems that would actually deliver the prosperity and security that domestic authorities had only pretended to provide. Machiavelli observed that these alternative authorities typically gained credibility precisely because they had not yet been tested by the practical requirements of governance. Citizens who had learned to distrust established authorities because of revealed contradictions were eager to believe in alternatives that had not yet had the opportunity to develop their own contradictions. This dynamic created what Machiavelli considered the most tragic aspect of concealment collapse, the tendency for societies to move from one unsustainable system to another rather than developing more mature understanding of political necessity. Citizens who had discovered that their previous rulers were not genuinely committed to the ideals they proclaimed typically demanded that new rulers demonstrate such commitment, not recognizing that the gap between ideals and practice was an inherent feature of governance rather than a personal failing of particular leaders. The fifth and final stage was the reconstitution of concealment under new management. Machiavelli had observed that societies could not long endure the psychological burden of complete transparency about political reality. Citizens who had initially welcomed the collapse of traditional deceptions eventually developed a desperate hunger for new illusions that could restore meaning and purpose to their political participation. This hunger created opportunities for new authorities to establish their own architectures of concealment. Religious authorities could promise that spiritual transformation would eventually eliminate political contradictions. Popular leaders could promise that their personal virtue would bridge the gap between ideals and practice. Foreign rulers could promise that their different cultural background would enable them to avoid the corruptions that had destroyed domestic authorities. These new systems of concealment were often more crude and oppressive than their predecessors, precisely because they had to be constructed rapidly in response to crisis rather than developed gradually through centuries of refinement. The new authorities typically lacked the sophisticated understanding of their predecessors about the delicate balance required to maintain necessary deceptions while preserving enough operational flexibility for effective governance. Machiavelli illustrated this dynamic with his analysis of the transition from the Roman Republic to the Empire. The collapse of republican concealment had created a crisis of legitimacy that could only be resolved through the establishment of a new form of authority that promised to eliminate the contradictions that had destroyed the previous system. Augustus and his successors succeeded in creating such a system, but only by establishing a form of personal rule that was far more openly coercive than the republican system it replaced. The imperial system solved the problem of revealed contradictions by abandoning the pretense of citizen equality and constitutional governance that had become untenable under the republic. Citizens who had found republican complexity intolerable accepted imperial simplicity, even though imperial rule was in many respects more oppressive than republican rule had been. The price of eliminating visible contradictions was the elimination of the political freedoms that had made those contradictions visible in the first place. As Machiavelli concluded his hidden manuscript, he offered a final warning that synthesized his observations about the inevitable cycle of concealment, revelation, and reconcealment that shaped all political systems. The wise prince understands that the architecture of necessary deception is not a permanent solution to the problems of governance but rather a temporary expedient that must be constantly maintained and periodically renovated. The prince who believes that his particular system of concealment is eternal will find himself unprepared for the inevitable crisis when that system fails. Yet the prince who attempts to avoid this cycle by establishing a system of complete transparency will discover that such transparency makes governance itself impossible. Citizens who understand the full complexity and contradiction inherent in any political system will find themselves paralyzed by the burden of that knowledge. The art of statecraft lies not in eliminating the need for concealment but in managing its inevitable failure and reconstruction. The greatest danger to any state is not that its secrets will be revealed, for such revelations are inevitable and survivable. The greatest danger is that its rulers will lose the wisdom to distinguish between necessary concealment and arbitrary deception, between the temporary expedients required by political reality and the permanent truths that transcend political convenience. The prince who masters this distinction will find that even the collapse of concealment can be survived and turned to advantage. The prince who loses this distinction will find that no amount of secrecy can preserve a system that has lost its essential connection to the enduring requirements of human political life. The manuscript ended with a passage that revealed the depth of Machiavelli's understanding of his own position as both observer and participant in the political systems he analyzed. I have written these observations not because I believe they can prevent the cycles of concealment and revelation that shape all political life, but because I believe that understanding these cycles is the only way to navigate them with wisdom and dignity. The reader who seeks in these pages a formula for eternal rule will be disappointed. The reader who seeks to understand the permanent features of the human political condition may find some illumination in the darkness that surrounds us all. In the margins of the final page, written in a different ink and, apparently added years later, Machiavelli had inscribed a final thought: "Time has proven these observations more prescient than I wished." The things that must remain concealed have a way of revealing themselves regardless of human intention. The wise ruler prepares not for the success of concealment but for its inevitable failure. In that preparation lies the difference between political tragedy and political wisdom. The manuscript concluded not with solutions or recommendations but with the recognition that political life was inherently tragic, not because it involved suffering or conflict, which could be managed or resolved, but because it required the acceptance of contradictions that could never be permanently reconciled. The art of statecraft lay not in eliminating these contradictions but in managing them with sufficient skill that they served human flourishing rather than human destruction. It was a lesson that would remain as relevant in future centuries as it had been in Machiavelli's own troubled time.